The wind that swept across the Wyoming Valley that winter carried more than cold. It carried loneliness. And on the largest ranch between Cheyenne and the Montana border, a wealthy cowboy sat in the dark and pretended to sleep, about to discover something that would change his life forever. Ethan Rollins had everything a man could earn with hard work. 5,000 acres of grazing land, hundreds of cattle, 30 loyal cowboys, a grand ranch house with polished floors, real glass windows, and rugs shipped all the way from Denver. At 32, he was one of the richest ranchers in the territory. Men respected him. Bankers feared him. Neighbors envied him. But when the sun set behind the mountains and the house grew quiet, none of that mattered. 3 years earlier, fever had taken his wife Sarah and their little boy James within the same cruel week. Since then, Ethan had built walls around himself, higher than any fence on his land. He worked from dawn until midnight, buried himself in ledgers and cattle contracts, anything to keep from remembering the sound of his son's laughter or the warmth of his wife's hand in his. The house ran like a machine. Mrs. Henderson, his stern but loyal housekeeper, kept everything spotless. The ranch hands followed orders. Meals arrived on time. No one asked personal questions. Until Clara Bennett arrived. She had come from Ohio 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a small suitcase and a letter from a pastor who was now dead. She was 20, slight of build, with wheat-colored hair always pulled into a neat bun and gray eyes that rarely lifted from the floor. Her dresses were plain brown calico, worn thin but always clean. She moved quietly through the house like she was afraid of taking up space. Ethan noticed her nervous habits almost at once, the way she startled at loud voices, the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee, the way she kept her gaze lowered whenever he entered a room. Mrs. Henderson had told him the story in private. A merchant's daughter from Cincinnati. Father ruined by bad investments. Drink followed. Then death. Mother soon after. Clara had come west alone to survive. Any honest work would do. Ethan told himself she was simply another employee. But one night, everything shifted. It was near midnight when he heard her voice, soft, low, almost like she was speaking to herself. He had gone back down the hallway after retiring to his room, drawn by the sound. The kitchen lamp still burned. Clara stood at the wash basin, cleaning the last of the dishes. "Tomorrow I'll polish the silver again," she murmured to the empty room. "Even if Mrs. Henderson says once a week is enough. Mr. Rollins doesn't use the parlor much, but it should still be proper." Her voice caught slightly. "Some girls end up in far worse places. You're lucky, Clara Marie. A roof, wages, safety." Ethan stood in the shadows, unseen. He felt something tighten in his chest. Then she said something that stopped him cold. "Mr. Rollins is a fair employer, even if he looks at ghosts most of the time." He stepped back, shaken. He thought he had hidden his grief well. But this quiet girl had seen through him in 3 weeks. The next evening, a strange idea took hold of him. After supper, he carried his ledgers into the study as usual. The fire burned low in the stone hearth. The portrait of Sarah and James hung on the wall, the only personal thing he allowed himself to keep near. He loosened his collar, kicked off his boots, settled into the leather chair by the dying fire, and closed his eyes. He kept his breathing slow and steady. He did not wait long. The door creaked open. Clara's footsteps were light but careful. She paused in the doorway. "Oh," she whispered. Through half-closed lashes, Ethan watched her freeze, tray in hand. She had come for the dishes he had deliberately left behind. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she moved forward. She gathered the plates quietly, stacking them without a sound. But instead of leaving, she hesitated beside his chair. Ethan felt the faintest brush of fabric. She was lifting the wool blanket that hung on the chair and gently placing it over his shoulders. Her touch was careful, tender, as if he were something fragile. "Poor man," she whispered so softly he almost missed it. "Working yourself to exhaustion won't bring them back." The words struck deeper than any insult ever could. She moved to the fireplace, adding another log, coaxing the flames higher so the room would stay warm. Then she stood before the portrait of his wife and child. "You had a beautiful family," she said quietly. "I hope you find peace someday." Ethan's chest burned. No one had spoken of Sarah in this house in 3 years. She returned to his side once more. "Sleep well, sir," she murmured. "Tomorrow's a new day." The door closed softly behind her. Ethan opened his eyes to a room brighter than before. The fire glowed strong. The blanket rested around him like a silent promise. For 3 years he had believed kindness had left his world. But the shy maid, who barely met his eyes, had just shown him a heart braver than most men he knew. And for the first time since the fever took everything from him, Ethan Rollins did not feel entirely alone. The next night, Ethan did it again. After supper, he carried his ledgers into the study, left the dishes on his desk, and settled into the leather chair by the fire. He loosened his collar, stretched his legs out, and let his head fall back as if sleep had claimed him. But this time, it was no simple curiosity. He wanted to know if what he had seen the night before was real. If the shy, trembling girl, who barely spoke above a whisper, truly carried that quiet strength inside her. Near midnight, the door opened once more. Clara stepped inside with the same careful grace. She paused when she saw him slumped in the chair. "Oh," she breathed softly. She moved closer, gathering the plates. Her hands were steadier tonight, but her face looked tired. Faint shadows rested beneath her gray eyes. When she reached his chair, she stopped again. "You'll catch cold like this," she whispered. She lifted the blanket and tucked it around him more securely than the night before. Her fingers brushed his shoulder, lingering for just a second. Then she did something that made his chest tighten. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small tin. "Your hands," she murmured. "They're cracked from the cold. Mama used to make this salve from beeswax and herbs. I made some for you. I hope you don't mind." She set the tin carefully on the side table. "I know what it's like to lose everything," she continued quietly. "When Papa died, I thought the world had ended. I worked myself sick, trying not to feel it. It doesn't help. It just makes you more tired." She studied his face in the firelight. "You're not as old as you try to look, Mr. Rollins. Grief just makes you seem that way." Ethan had to fight the urge to open his eyes. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Not as a wealthy rancher, not as a man to be respected, but as a human being. She moved to the portrait again. "You're still here," she said softly. "That has to mean something." The pattern continued for several nights. Each evening, Ethan pretended sleep had claimed him. Each evening, Clara came quietly after her chores. And each night, she revealed more of herself. Sometimes she talked about her mother and how she believed knowledge was more valuable than gold. Sometimes she spoke about the train ride west and the girl who had gotten off in Denver to work at a dance hall. "That could have been me," she once whispered, "if I hadn't found this position." Her voice trembled that night. "Thank you for giving me honest work, Mr. Rollins. You don't even know what you saved me from." By the 7th night, Ethan was no longer testing her. He was listening because he needed to. But that night felt different. Her footsteps were slower, heavier. When she entered the room, he could hear her breathing unevenly. She set down the tray with shaking hands. "Just a little fever," she whispered to herself. "Nothing to fuss about." She swayed. Without thinking, Ethan opened his eyes and lunged forward, just as her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the floor. Her gray eyes flew wide with shock. "Mr. Rollins," she gasped. "You were awake." "I was," he said firmly, steadying her. "And you are burning up." "I'm fine," she insisted weakly. "Please don't wake Mrs. Henderson. I can't afford to be trouble." "You are not trouble." He guided her into the chair and called for Mrs. Henderson despite her protests. Within minutes, the housekeeper was there, clucking in disapproval. "Fever," she declared, "and overworked besides." Ethan sent a ranch hand racing for Dr. Morrison, ignoring the raised brows at fetching a physician in the middle of the night for a housemaid. Clara looked mortified. "He must think me foolish," she whispered to Mrs. Henderson. "Talking to him all those nights." But Ethan heard it, and he did not think her foolish. He thought her brave. For 3 days, Clara was confined to bed on his orders. Mrs. Henderson tended to her, but Ethan found himself pacing the halls, uneasy in a way he had not felt even during harsh cattle drives. He noticed things now: the heavy iron pots she lifted daily, the buckets she carried from the pump, the hours of scrubbing that left her hands red and raw. He had been blind. On the 4th day, he knocked on her door. She was sitting up, pale, but improving, trying to mend a dress. "Miss Bennett," he said gently, "I owe you an apology." Her eyes widened. "For what?" "For pretending to sleep." Color flooded her cheeks. "You knew?" "Every word," he admitted. "The blanket, the fire, the salve, the kindness." She covered her face briefly in embarrassment. "I must seem very forward." "No," he said firmly. "You seem kind." Silence filled the small room. Then she looked at him, truly looked at him. "I know what it's like to feel alone behind glass," she said quietly. "Like no one can reach you." The words struck him hard. "Clara," he said, using her name for the first time, "you have done more for this house in 3 weeks than anyone has in 3 years." Her breath caught. "When you recover," he continued, "I want you to take the role of head housemaid. Lighter duties, higher wages. But I have only been here a short time, and you have shown more strength than most." She studied him carefully. "Were you truly awake every night?" "Yes," he said. She groaned softly in embarrassment. "I must have sounded foolish." "No," he said again, his voice low and steady. "You sounded like hope." And for the first time in years, Ethan Rollins realized he had not been testing her at all. He had been testing whether his own heart was still alive. Winter did not loosen its grip easily that year. In February, a sudden blizzard rolled down from the mountains without warning. Ethan had ridden out to check on the north pasture before the storm clouds darkened the sky. Charlie had warned him. "Storm's coming fast, boss." "I'll be back before it hits," Ethan had replied. But the storm was faster. Within minutes, the sky turned white. Snow fell so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. The wind howled like something alive and angry. Ice bit into his skin through wool and leather. By the time he found shelter in a small line shack near the valley, his hands were numb and his body shaking. He managed to light a weak fire, but it barely held back the cold. He spent the night fighting sleep, fighting the kind of sleep that never ends. When the storm eased near dawn, he forced himself back onto his horse and began the slow ride home through deep drifts. What should have taken an hour took nearly 3. By the time the ranch house came into view, he was barely conscious. He reached the kitchen door. Then his legs gave out. The door flew open before he could fall fully into the snow. Clara stood there, still dressed despite the late hour, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Rollins." She caught him as he swayed, her small frame somehow strong enough to keep him upright. "Mrs. Henderson," she called sharply. "Bring blankets and warm water." Inside, the kitchen was hot from the stove. Clara knelt in front of him, pulling off his frozen gloves. When she saw his white, waxy fingers, her breath caught. "Frostbite," she whispered. "We must warm them slowly." Her hands were steady now, not shy, not trembling, strong. She warmed his fingers between her palms, rubbing gently, speaking to him in a low, firm voice. "This will hurt when the feeling comes back," she said. "But that means you're healing." When violent shivers shook his body, she did not hesitate. She wrapped her arms around him, sharing her warmth without a thought for propriety. For hours, she stayed by his side. When he finally woke the next afternoon, sunlight streamed through his window. Clara was there. "You're awake," she said, relief flooding her face. "You stayed," he croaked. "Of course." He watched her move around the room, adding wood to the fire, checking his hands with careful fingers. "You saved me," he said simply. She shook her head. "I just did what needed doing." "No," he said. "You chose to care." Silence settled between them. Then he spoke again. "Clara, when I pretended to sleep those nights, I thought I was testing you." She looked at him in confusion. "But I was wrong," he continued. "I was testing whether I could feel anything again." Her breath caught. "You broke through walls I thought would stand forever," he said quietly. "You brought life back into this house, back into me." Her gray eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to overstep," she whispered. "You didn't." He reached for her hand. "Clara Bennett, I don't want you in this house as a servant anymore." Her face went pale. "I've done something wrong?" "You've done everything right." He sat up despite the ache in his body. "I want you here because you choose to be, not because you need wages, not because you have nowhere else to go." She stared at him, barely breathing. "I have been a lonely man for 3 years," he continued. "And you saw that. You covered me with a blanket when you thought I would never know. You spoke kindness into a room that had forgotten the sound of it." His voice grew steady. "I do not want to pretend to sleep anymore." The words hung in the air between them. Clara's hands trembled, but this time not from fear. "Ethan," she said softly, using his name without hesitation. He stood, still weak but certain. "I cannot promise you an easy life," he said. "There will be storms. There will be gossip. There will be hard winters." She stepped closer. "I've survived worse," she said. "I cannot promise I will not carry scars," he added. "So do I," she replied. For a moment, they simply stood there, years of grief and fear falling away. Then he drew her into his arms. No pretense, no walls, just warmth. The wind still howled outside the ranch house, but inside, the fire burned bright. The house that had once felt like a tomb felt alive again. And from that night forward, Ethan Rollins never pretended to sleep again. Because he no longer feared what he might feel. He had found it. In the quiet courage of a shy maid who chose kindness when she thought no one was watching. And in choosing her, he chose to live again.